The Treatise on the Resurrection, which is also known as the Letter to Reginos, which if I'm saying it wrong, I apologize, addresses the Gnostic concept of resurrection, emphasizing its necessity even though many lack faith in it. It held a significantly different meaning for many Gnostic groups compared to the prevailing Orthodox Christian view. While Orthodox Christianity emphasized a literal physical resurrection of the body at the end times, often modeled on the resurrection of Jesus Christ's physical body, Gnosticism largely favored a spiritual resurrection, a transformation of the inner self that could be experienced in the present. In Orthodox Christianity, resurrection is primarily a physical event, which involves the raising of the body from the dead, often in a glorified and transformed state, but still recognizably physical. This was seen as a future hope tied to the final judgment and the new creation. The physical body, though subject to decay and death, was generally seen as an integral part of the human being and destined for resurrection and glorification. The incarnation of Christ and his physical resurrection affirmed the goodness of creation, including the body. Christ's physical resurrection was a foundational event guaranteeing the future physical resurrection of believers and the defeat of death. For Gnosticism, it's primarily a spiritual or psychological event. Resurrection was understood as the awakening of the soul from the sleep of ignorance and its liberation from the material realm. It was about realizing one's true divine nature and ascending to the spiritual pleroma. This could be an ongoing process or a realized state within this lifetime. Gnosticism often views the physical body as a prison or a temporary vessel for the soul. Salvation involved escaping the limitations of the material body, so a physical resurrection will be seen as desirable or even nonsensical. This focus was on the liberation of the spiritual essence. While Christ was often seen as a revealer of truth who overcame the limitations of the material world, his resurrection was sometimes interpreted symbolically as the triumph of the spirit over matter, or as the attainment of spiritual knowledge that believers could also achieve. Some Gnostic groups even held docetic views, suggesting Christ only appeared to have a physical body, and thus his resurrection wasn't physical in the Orthodox sense. This Gnostic text, the Treatise on the Resurrection from the Nag Hammadi Library, offers a glimpse into one particular Gnostic perspective on resurrection. It takes the form of a letter from an unnamed Gnostic teacher to a student named Rheginos, who was apparently asked about the nature of resurrection. The core of the argument within the treatise is a radical assertion that believers don't need to wait for a future event to experience resurrection. It's something that has already occurred in a spiritual sense the moment they embrace the truth, that is, Gnosis, the liberating knowledge of their true divine nature and their connection to the spiritual realm. The author urges Reginos, the recipient of the letter, to actively consider himself as already having risen. This isn't just a hopeful future promise. It's a present reality to be grasped and lived in. The death from which one is resurrected isn't physical demise, but rather the state of ignorance and entanglement in the illusion of the material world. To gain knowledge of the truth is to awaken from this spiritual slumber, to rise above the limitations and deceptions of earthly existence. A key point the author of the Treatise on the Resurrection emphasizes is the reality of the resurrection experience, directly contrasting it with the perceived illusory nature of the material world. He's not saying that resurrection is just a nice idea or a comforting fantasy. He insists it's something genuinely real and transformative. To make this point, the author often depicts the material world as being in a constant state of flux and change, subject to decay and impermanence. If you think about it, everything we see and touch in this physical realm is temporary. It grows, ages, and eventually fades away. In contrast, the spiritual realm, the realm of true being and the divine pleroma, is seen as eternal, unchanging, and truly real. So the resurrection, which is the awakening of the soul to its true spiritual nature and its connection to the eternal realm, is presented as a move from the illusory and transient to the real and permanent. The knowledge of the truth allows the bearer to see through the deceptive appearances of the material world and recognize the underlying, enduring reality of their spiritual essence. The author seems to be arguing that clinging to the physical world and its impermanent nature is what keeps us in a state of spiritual death or ignorance. True life and true reality are found in the spiritual realm. The resurrection, then, is the realization of this truth and the aligning of oneself with this higher reality. It's not about something being conjured out of nothing. It's about recognizing and embracing a pre-existing eternal reality that has been obscured by our immersion in the illusory material world. The emphasis is on discernment, distinguishing the fleeting shadow of the material world from the substantial light of the spiritual. The author of the treatise doesn't portray resurrection as simply bringing a dead body back to its former state. Instead, it's depicted as a fundamental shift, a metamorphosis of existence itself. The phrase transformation of things suggests that resurrection isn't just about individuals, it has implications for the very fabric of reality as we perceive it. The old decaying order is being replaced by something new and imperishable. This transition into newness points to a change to the very being of the individual who has experienced the spiritual resurrection. It's not about gaining knowledge, it's about becoming a new kind of being, one that is no longer bound by the limitations and illusions of the material world. This newness likely refers to a state of being more aligned with the eternal spiritual realm, perhaps possessing new capacities of understanding, perception, and existence. Consider the analogy of a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly. The butterfly is not just a caterpillar brought back to life, it's a completely different form of existence with new abilities and a new way of interacting with the world. Similarly, spiritual resurrection in Gnosticism isn't a return to the old limited self, but a radical transformation into a higher, more authentic mode of being. This emphasis on transformation, rather than physical reanimation, aligns with the Gnostic view of the material body as transient and ultimately something to be transcended. The newness achieved through resurrection is a release from the constraints of the physical and an entry into a more spiritual and eternal form of existence. It's about shedding the old and embracing a completely new reality that is accessed through Gnosis and the awakening of the inner spirit. The author of the treatise doesn't just present the idea of spiritual resurrection as an abstract concept. They ground it in the figure of Christ himself. The text states that Christ swallowed death and raised himself up. This isn't necessarily a direct parallel to the Orthodox Christian understanding of Christ's physical resurrection, but rather a model for the spiritual transformation that believers can also undergo. When the treatise says Christ swallowed death, it likely refers to his transcendence of the power of the material world and the ignorance that binds the souls. He overcame the spiritual death of alienation from the divine through his own attainment of Gnosis and his ascent to the higher realm. In raising himself up, the text emphasizes Christ's inherent divine power and his ability to overcome the limitations of earthly existence. So, Christ serves as the ultimate example and the prototype for the believer's own spiritual journey. His experience of swallowing death and raising himself up demonstrates the possibility and the path for others to achieve a similar spiritual resurrection within themselves. By understanding Christ's true nature and following his teachings, believers can also overcome the spiritual death of ignorance and ascend to a higher state of being even while still living in the material world. The treatise suggests that by identifying with Christ's experience and embracing the truth he revealed, believers can participate in this same transformative power. They can, in a sense, follow in his footsteps by dying to their old ignorant selves and rising to a new understanding of their divine potential. Christ's resurrection in this Gnostic context isn't just a historical event to be believed, it's a living reality that believers can embody in their own spiritual awakening and ascent. The treatise hints at an interesting concept that the resurrected individual doesn't simply return to their former physical body. Instead, it suggests the existence of a spiritual body or members that the resurrected person possesses, a form being distinct from the physical flesh that is left behind to decay. This idea aligns with the broader Gnostic understanding of the physical body as temporary and even a hindrance to the soul's true spiritual destiny. The resurrection being a liberation from the material realm and an ascent to the higher spiritual realms would naturally involve a transition to a more appropriate form of existence, a spiritual one. It's like this. If you were to travel to a completely different environment, like if you went to underwater or something, you would need a different kind of body or different equipment, like a diving suit or something, to function effectively. Similarly, in the spiritual realm, the coarse physical body wouldn't be suitable. The spiritual body mentioned in the treatise likely refers to a refined, luminous form of being that is more akin to the divine realm and capable of existing within it. The use of the term members might suggest that this spiritual body still retains a kind of structure or organization, perhaps analogous to the physical body, but composed of a different and more subtle substance or energy. It implies a continuity of identity in a transformed state rather than a complete dissolution or formlessness. This concept of a spiritual body underscores the Gnostic emphasis on the primary of the spirit over matter. The true self, the divine spark within, is what is resurrected and clothed in a new spiritual form that is fitting for its eternal destiny. The physical flesh, being part of the transient material world, is ultimately left behind as the soul ascends to its true home. The treatise doesn't explicitly spell out a step-by-step process, but the entire argument strongly implies that the attainment of Gnosis is the very key to experiencing this present resurrection. The death from which one rises is the state of ignorance, the lack of understanding of one's true nature, origin, and destiny. Conversely, Knowing the truth is the act of awakening, the spiritual resurrection itself. For Gnostics, salvation wasn't primarily about faith in external doctrines or adherence to rituals. It's about a personal transformative understanding of the divine and one's place within it. This Gnosis shatters the illusions of the material world and reveals the eternal reality of the spiritual realm. When the believer attains this knowledge, they are no longer bound by the ignorance that keeps the soul in a state of spiritual death. Gnosis is the light that dispels the darkness of ignorance. In the darkness, one is lost and doesn't know their way. But when the light of true knowledge dawns, the path becomes clear and the individual can orient themselves towards their true home. This seeing or understanding is the rising from the darkness of unknowing, the spiritual resurrection. The call to Reginos to see himself as already risen is a direct consequence of having access to this truth. The teachings within the Gnostic tradition, and likely within the specific treatise, aim to impart this Gnosis. By grasping these truths about the nature of reality, the self, and the divine, the believer participates in the resurrection here and now. The transformation and newness spoken of are the direct results of this liberating knowledge, which reorients the individual's consciousness and aligns them with the eternal spiritual reality. Interestingly, the treatise on the resurrection has some elements that seem closer to certain proto-Orthodox ideas, such as affirming that Christ lived as flesh and was both human and divine, which might be seen as a rejection of strict asceticism. However, its overall emphasis on a present spiritual transformation aligns firmly within a Gnostic framework. The concept of resurrection was a significant point of divergence between Gnostic and Orthodox Christian thought. Gnosticism, as exemplified in the texts like Exegesis on the Soul, and further elaborated in the Treatise on the Resurrection, generally emphasize a spiritual awakening and transformation of the inner self, attainable through Gnosis rather than the literal physical resurrection championed by Orthodox Christianity.